Hi, everybody. Today's Tuesday, March 10th, 2026, and our dear friend John Helmer is here with us. Welcome back, John.
Thank you, Nima. Good to be back.
John, let me start with the conflict, with the war between the United States and Iran. And the situation is something that it seems that is turning to a war of attrition. Yesterday, Donald Trump was saying that uh, in from what he understands so far, that the war is somehow over. It was so strange to hear that, because he says that we achieved all of our objectives, and any moment we can declare that, and all of this sort of nonsense so far. But when it comes to the war of attrition, if the situation goes in that direction, I don't know how is the possibility of that case. But who's going to be the winner of the conflict, and who's going to lose more? Who's going to lose less?
I think it's very clear that the Trump policy is to shorten the war as quickly as possible and open Hormuz as quickly as possible. And that's the reason Trump initiated a telephone call with President Trump a few hours ago. But let me come to the reading of the Russian details, because they're very significant. But begin with a very simple, maybe so obvious point. The general point when we're talking about military operations, political operations, and strategy is that empires don't end so quickly, and they don't end even when their emperors go mad. Let's understand a little bit more about the nature of the US empire and how it can survive even a loss in this war. And let's try to reduce the amount of exaggeration that a lot of wishful thinking, hope for better outcome for Iran, for example, for the Arabs and the Palestinians, for example. Wishful thinking won't bring down the US empire, and it's not losing soon. General point. Evidence. Let's go to the evidence. Let me turn to what exactly happened. When President Trump, with a group, he said there was quite a group of people on the line with him when they spoke for an hour with President Putin a few hours ago. It's very significant that the American side initiated the call. And now I'll read you, or I'm looking at, the readout that was given by Yuri Ushakov, the president's national security advisor. And let me make his points, because this points at the way in which a war like this generates political division inside each of the combatant states, inside Russia, inside China, inside Iran, inside Israel, inside the Arab states, inside India. All these states are having political turmoil because there are very many serious differences. That's to state the obvious. But once one understands what's happening in political terms, we come to different conclusions. The first thing that the readout indicates is that that the president made each president made a review of the situation, and the text of Ushakov indicates to me that the Trump wants to make sure that the war will not be lengthened by anything Russia does. It's very important, obviously, because the question of how much satellite intelligence, operational air defense intelligence, targeting intelligence, missile expertise, all of that stuff that China and Russia are providing Iran, or may provide Iran, or will provide Iran, or will resupply Iran. All of those issues lengthen the war. Trump wanted, it's clear from the text, to ask Putin to refrain from lengthening the war by helping Iran. He then offered, in exchange, increased US support for shortening the war in the Ukraine. In other words, Putin was offered a US deal. You stay out of the Iran war. You help us shorten the war on our objectives against Iran. You do little or nothing to assist Iran. We help you in your objectives with the Ukraine. That's the first and most important point to understand that the two presidents talked about. Second, of course, it's not public, but there it is in the text and in the understanding of my sources. The second point I read out, on our part, says Ushakov, the Russian part, a positive assessment of the mediation efforts made by the team of Donald Trump and personally was made. What does that mean? That's Putin's endorsement of what Kirill Dmitriev's been doing with Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner. That's very serious. After all, the entire world has seen Witkoff and Kushner perform a deception operation against Iran, a manipulation of negotiations, first about enrichment, then about missile capacity, and then negotiations without end to cover the preparations for imminent war. These two, as we've said before, as many of our colleagues on your program have said, Witkoff and Kushner have discredited themselves as negotiators. And yet there we have it. Putin has accepted Witkoff and Kushner as with a, quotes, positive assessment of the mediation efforts. That's quite a turn for Russia to say such a thing. Finally, I'll just read it, looking down to read it. The presidents also touched upon the question of Venezuela and, first of all, the situation in the oil market. This is very significant too. What that means is the following, that Trump has offered to lift sanctions, relieve sanctions against the sale of Russian oil on a couple of conditions. One is that Russia does not sell its excess oil, or the oil that would otherwise be sanctioned, we'll get into the numbers a bit later, to China. I don't believe it's clearly understood in the strategy world, in the discussion that we're having here, that the US is not only aiming at Iran, it has another war to fight against China. When the Hormuz closes, China, and you ask the question, who is the biggest loser? Which is the biggest state losing the most? Answer, China. And that's a US objective. If you like, we can go through the numbers, but essentially we know that roughly 11 to 12 million barrels a day of oil is required for China's imports, and more than 5 million barrels a day have just been lost. We know that a certain amount, I can come in with the numbers, of Russian oil is floating in stock in tankers at sea. Could be sold to India, could be sold to Russia. We also know that Russia can increase its output by roughly 300 to 400,000 barrels a day, but there is no way Russia could meet a 5 or 6 million barrel a day Chinese deficit. The US wants to press that deficit on China. Second, and Trump said it, I'll reach for my other paper. He said in a tweet a few hours ago, and this is a giveaway of what was said with Putin. Trump said in a tweet, the threat is to Iran, mustn't do anything to stop the flow of oil within the Strait of Hormuz because they'll be hit harder. Well, they're already, the Hormuz is closed. This says Trump, is a gift from the United States to China and all those nations that heavily use the Hormuz Strait. In other words, Trump is saying he will open Hormuz as a gift to China. He doesn't really want to give gifts to China, but China and it is taking an approach to Iran as secondary to its need to solve its problems with the United States and mitigate, reduce the amount of enmity the United States aims at China, which will be the next target. After Iran, Cuba maybe, but Cuba's small by comparison to China. We've talked here before, strategically, the US will sequence away from one losing war to the next, and away from Iran to China. The Strait of Hormuz closes against China. From a US point of view, the US suffers what Trump has called a temporary price increase, and it's clear that US voters understand that it could be long. Therefore, the US, for its reasons, want to shorten the war, but closed Hormuz damages China, and that's a US strategic asset. So what has Trump said to Putin? I will let you sell oil to Europe. Don't sell oil to China. That's what was said. Now, those three things aren't really the interpretation in Moscow, because there's a severe argument, and we've talked about it before, political debate between people of goodwill over what should be Russian strategy. Now, what that readout I've just indicated means is that Putin continues to endorse Kirill Dmitriev's approach with Witkoff and Kushner, its first thing, which is bitterly opposed by some factions in Moscow. And Dmitriev has been busy tweeting that he sees the opportunity now to resume oil sales with Europe. Against that background, and it's already happening, I've read the Kepler. I recommend to everyone, if they want to understand the oil trade, start with Kepler and some of the oil trade analysis reports. Kepler is already saying sanctions enforcement for Russian oil sales to Europe are already disappearing. Cargoes are beginning to move again to Europe. So what are we seeing here? In answer to your question, whatever the outcome of this war is and will be, the US wants to hurt China most after Iran. It's willing to drive a wedge between Russia and China and between Russia and India and encourage action against China, which India supports. You've got to see this war and its outcome and the long war and the short war as affecting these general factors. So what Trump is trying to do is shorten the war for US voters. You can see there's been no rally round the flag for Trump. A point or two improvement in overall approval, but it's still trailing well behind his disapproval rate. The rate of disapproval of the war in Iran is only running at about 6%. I could look at the numbers, get them right. It's relatively small, but there's a jump in the fear of inflation. That's the killer at election time later in the year. So Trump needs to assure the US electorate there won't be a big inflation spike for long. He wants a short war, and he wants Hormuz open as a gift to the Chinese. On the other hand, he's basically saying, if I can't get a short war, if and you mentioned the propaganda, everybody can see the propaganda. If everything is the way the Pentagon briefings say, the White House briefings say, if that were all true, and you'll have Ted Postel come on later and explain why it isn't true, but if the propaganda is true, Trump wants to make sure that in a long war, China loses most, and Russia doesn't help either Iran or China.
John, I think that is so. How would you think that Donald Trump could convince Russia to betray Iran and China? Because after all, who's going to believe in Europe anymore? Who's going to believe that Europe could be a reliable market for Russian oil? Or even with the sanctions on India, Donald Trump is selling something to Russia that is not, you know, because of Russia is asking for, because India is putting a lot of pressure on Donald Trump because they're in a desperate situation. They need the Russian oil more and more. That's why Donald Trump is doing this. It's calling, no, it's somehow it's a losing hand in my opinion on the part of Donald Trump, and who I don't see he's being taken seriously by the Russian president, because after all, what's gonna be the gain? What would be the benefit suggested to Vladimir Putin? Because
Well,
he mentioned that Europe doesn't, he may just stop selling Europe. Of course, he's not talking about Hungary, Slovakia, these countries where, they don't consider them as Europe, as the hardcore Europe. I'm talking about the Western European countries, France, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Italy.
mhm.
What is that? I don't see
Well,
Donald Trump have any sort of leverage on the Russian president, Vladimir
well,
Putin.
it seems to me that the readout says he does. And what's that leverage? Well, let's try and spell it out. In the first place, as I said, there are political factions in Moscow, some of whom would agree with what you've just said, that you can't trust Witkoff, you can't trust Kushner, you can't trust Trump. We have to accelerate the military advance westward. We have to maximize the level of electricity war campaign to destroy the capacity of Kiev to continue the war. There's a faction that says that, and therefore, what's left to negotiate with Trump? Let's get on with winning our war by ourselves, right? But that's not the only faction. Kirill Dmitriev, to answer your question, thinks and says, I can reach over and pull up his tweets. He says, and he's been saying for some days now, Europe, look, we told you so. We are a reliable supplier of gas and oil. You've made the big mistake. Now there's a war. The Hormuz is closed. You can't get oil from the Middle East. Don't you realize your big mistake? We love you. Come back to Russia. We'll give you what you want. Now, that means, what does that mean? It means that there is a faction in Moscow that's represented publicly by Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russia Direct Investment Fund, who's educated in the United States, who's pro-American, who's continuously negotiating with Witkoff and Kushner, and is not the slightest bit interested in Iran, nor China. He's pro-European. He wants pro-American, pro-European reorientation of Russian policy. That's what he stands for. So the answer to your question is that from Trump's point of view, he can continue to count on a faction in Moscow that would betray, you could say the word betray, but let's come to the particulars in a minute. You could say that Trump thinks and has calculated that if he gives Putin enough concessions on the Ukraine war that Russia has been demanding and asks in return two things. One, don't assist Iran to keep the war going, and don't sell oil to China. Those two things, for those two things, Putin would achieve a significant series of concessions, whether Zelensky or Merz or Starmer or Stubb or any of the other European leaders like it or not. So from a short-term war settlement point of view in the Ukraine, there's a strong faction in Moscow that thinks they and Trump have the leverage to achieve a Ukraine war settlement at the price of, you called it, betraying Iran and betraying China. That's what they think. Does that answer your question? I'm not saying that the political faction fight's over in Moscow, but when I read out what Yuri Ushakov has said as the readout, you see there the President Putin's endorsement to Trump of the Dmitriev faction. That's what that means. Is Dmitry Medvedev, the former president, spokesman for another faction in the Security Council, going to gainsay that? Let's wait and see. But does that answer your question? There is, in Trump's administration's mind, and there is evidence on the Kremlin side of Russian support for such a deal. Yes, unfortunately, for those who think that the Russian side is backing Iran to win because there's a greater strategic stake for Russia in protecting Iran and the southern flank, for those who think this or that, this is a betrayal, a stab in the back, no doubt about it, from their point of view. Yes. Second, from the Chinese point of view, we've been saying since last December, there's a significant difference between China's approach to the United States and what it thinks Russia's approach to the United States is going to be. And what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 days, especially the March 8 press conference China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi gave, he barely mentioned the word Iran. He didn't mention the word Israel. And he endorsed positively a welcome for President Trump to come to China on March the 31st for the 3-day state visit, and laid out what China's priority would be. So from an American point of view, they think they've got China nice and nervous. And from a Chinese point of view, you could say Wang suggested that China would let Iran be defeated for China's longer-term priorities. Now, I understand many in our audience and many of our colleagues can lay out evidence or hope. There's a bit of a difference between hope and evidence, that China is supplying significant targeting and air defense and missile supply support for Iran, just as Russia is doing. The question is whether Wang Yi is to be believed or the evidence of that support is to be believed. But your question was a bit different. Why would the President of the United States, fighting a war to destroy Iran more or less totally, think he has leverage with China and Russia and India in his war? And what I'm trying to say is he's not mad to think he's got that leverage, because in each of the politics of each of those states, we can see there is a pro-American faction which says we will accept the loss of Iran for our own benefit. Does that sound unusual to you? Does it sound surprising to you?
You know, the way I understand the policymakers in Russia is that they're not out to negotiate and sacrifice the relationship between Russia and Iran or Russia and China in sake of a better relationship, with the United States and Europeans. I see the policies are much more complex, and they're not that simple, in my opinion, because on one hand, you see it's impossible to my mind that Russia would sacrifice Iran and China for a better relationship with the United States. It's impossible. But on the other hand, you've mentioned the empire is still the empire. And
Mm,
Russia understands that the empire has its leverage. China understands that. Iran understands that. That's why they're trying to do, whoever is talking about that China is trying to negotiate to talk with Americans, that's the normal, behavior on the part of the state, because the state wants to reduce the collateral damage of such a collusion between the two, between
mm,
China and the United States, between Russia and the United States, even in Iran, between Iran and the United States. That's
mm.
why they're trying to define their policies based on the reality. Russia sees the reality in Ukraine and how the United States can be helpful in solving the situation. That's why they're trying to do their best with the faction that you mentioned, Kirill Dmitriev. They're
Yes.
trying to do something with that because they feel that Kirill Dmitriev may be able to do something to improve the situation with Europeans, with the United States in Ukraine. On the other hand, we've seen the messages sending, for example, Putin sending the message, his congratulation to this new supreme leader of Iran. You
Mhm.
see, he says unwavering support of Russia for what Iran is doing. And these are huge messages. I don't
Well,
think that Russia
hang on.
would sacrifice. After all, Kirill Dmitriev is not, the policymaker in in Moscow. Who's gonna decide after all? Gonna be Putin and Medvedev and these people who are high rank. Kirill Dmitriev is a technician. It's someone
No,
who is
I don't.
negotiating. He's not policymaker.
I disagree. Uh, in one way, we're basically agreeing. Um, Second, if the words that were used with respect to the condolences for the assassination of Khamenei, which were conveyed by President Putin, the personal condolences, and second, the endorsement of the succession and the telephone call with President Pezeshkian, if the words have meaning now, what words were there from Russia or China when they knew the war was about to happen? What deterrence did the Russian and Chinese governments seek to use before the war broke out? I'd say they did not deter. They used no deterrence against the United States to deter when they could have done so, when they could have said so. Second, it's an explicit endorsement of Witkoff and Kushner personally. Iran doesn't endorse those two or anything they said and did. If I read Mr. Larijani's and Mr. Arakchi's remarks on those two, for Russia to endorse those two as continuingly effective negotiators, when they've proved that they are liars, when they've proved they are deception agents, is evidence against what you've concluded. I would have to say that we then are left with some operational information about which nobody is certain. There are some people who are more hopeful that Russia is providing a level of intelligence, material support, and for air defense, missile guidance, and targeting that has improved Iranian missile capability, improved their targeting and precision of targeting, and so forth. The same is being said of the Chinese. I'm willing to listen to that being said, but we are a bit short of proof on the ground, are we not? We're short of the proof of that. So what I'm saying is Trump has asked for less, asked for no resupply. Russia could begin to resupply overland or over the Caspian through Turkmenistan to Iran if Iran asks for it. Remember what we said last time when the issue came, what will Russia do as distinct from fine words? What will Russia do to support Iran's sovereignty in defense? President Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, said, they haven't asked. They haven't asked. What does that mean? We haven't done anything yet, but we will do something if they ask? Or does it mean we're telling them not to ask? Or does it mean we haven't decided yet and we'll trade away the perception that we might for whatever inducements Trump put on the table when a few hours ago when the telephone call happened? So I think the answer to your question is a complicated one. It's far from decided on the US side, far from decided on the Russian side. So what's happening on the battlefield? Are you sure that the level of Russian and Chinese aid is what is the maximum that Iran wants and asks for? I don't think we can say we're sure. We certainly can't be sure if the war goes into, let's say, 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks or longer, what resupply Iran would then need. Would then Russia be available, or has Putin promised Trump that in return for an accelerated settlement on Russian terms on the Ukraine battlefield, Russia will hang away from Iran's needs for the Iran battlefield? I think it's time we address that possibility. And it's not my opinion. I'm not giving a view here about what Russia ought to do morally or strategically. I'm simply saying the evidence today is Trump asked for the deal, and I'd say from Ushakov's readout, he got it. Anything that endorses Vitkov and Kushner at this point on the Russian side betrays the fundamental conclusion on the Iranian side that those two so-called negotiators are deception agents on their way to attacking Iran. And we've seen in the internet, we've seen among our colleagues a discussion, if the US used Vitkov and Kushner to lull Iran into unpreparedness before the attack twice, why wouldn't it try the same thing on Putin? After all, at least one recent and possibly two attacks have been made with assistance of the United States on Putin himself. Why would the Kremlin endorse those two negotiators if it wasn't intent in the belief that a deal could be done between the United States and Europe that would benefit Russia's war aims in the Ukraine and relief of the sanctions? I think that's the deal revealed by this telephone call. I think you're right. Go on. Yeah.
John, I don't think Donald Trump been that capable of solving the situation in Ukraine single-handedly, because it's not about Donald Trump and his administration. We have all these European countries in the calculation. These these are important players in Ukraine.
Yes.
You know, and Donald Trump has shown no leverage so far because of the complexity of power in the United States, because Donald Trump is not, the single decision maker in the United States. That's why the Europeans can somehow go against him in Ukraine. But when it comes to the policies of Russia, I don't see Donald Trump being that much capable or being in a position that position offers some sort of leverage. Donald Trump doesn't have anything because he's trapped, in my opinion, with the case of the Strait of Hormuz right now. he's in a dire situation with the Strait of Hormuz, because we had the phone call between, the foreign minister. I don't know how to call it. Is it prime minister of Japan? Or they have president or prime minister?
Prime Minister.
Yeah, but the foreign minister of Japan called the Iranian foreign minister, asking him for the situation that Japan is, in right now, because they're suffering from the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. They're somehow begging the Iranians to do something about it, because the United States is not in a good situation right now, because the most important allies of the United States in the East Asia, I'm talking about Japan and South Korea, they're in I would say they're in a very bad situation right now with their economies, with the reserves of oil. And that's why they're trying to put pressure on the United States. The United States is calling Russia to make some sort. That's why Donald Trump is talking about all the goals in this war against Iran have been achieved. He didn't achieve anything so far. He's under tremendous pressures from his allies. Not only Japan and South Korea, all these Arab states in the Persian Gulf, they're putting a lot of pressure on Donald Trump, because they've been devastated by this war. And how would you say that Donald Trump has the leverage on Putin? I would say Vladimir Putin is the winner of what is happening. He has the upper hand.
Well, we've been through this before. And so the question then becomes, everybody's been damaged by this war. Iran's been seriously damaged. Israel has been seriously damaged. The question...
I'm sure, John, just sorry for interrupting you. I'm not talking about focusing, because you've been comparing Russia to the United States. When it comes to Iran and Israel, yeah, we know that they're attacking each other. They're devastating the cities on both sides. But when we talk about Russia and the United States, the calculation is totally different from what is going on between Iran and Israel, because that's a war between the two countries, Iran and Israel. But when it comes to Russia and the United States, these are players who are fighting each other, who are in fight for more than 40 years. Russia totally understands that the main enemy in Ukraine is not Ukraine, is the collective West, is the United States.
Yes. Well, I'm not sure what points we are agreeing on or disagreeing on. Do we understand as evidence of what the telephone call amounted to? Because there hasn't been a US readout. Okay, no readout.
Which telephone call? The foreign minister of Japan?
No. I thought you were asking me about the telephone call between President Trump and President Putin. All President Trump has said was it was a positive call. I'm reading from his statement a couple of hours ago. We had a lot of people on the line from our side and from his side. We talked about Ukraine. We talked about the Middle East. He wants to be helpful. I said you could be more helpful by getting the Ukraine war, Russia over. That would be more helpful. We had a good talk. He wants to be constructive. Now, that's all the readout from the Trump side. On the Russian side, I've pointed out an endorsement of the Witkoff-Kushner mediation. So presumably that means it continues and that Dmitriev's the principal in that discussion. Second, we know that in the oil trade, there's already been some relaxation by the Europeans on delivery of Russian oil cargoes, both petroleum products and crude oil, into Europe. We think that what that telephone call meant was Trump offers to persuade the Europeans that everybody benefits if the sanctions against Russia selling into Europe are relaxed. Now, I'd say that the evidence of the market and the evidence of the readout are that Putin offered, in exchange for that, to a number of points Trump had to make on Iran, one of which is, don't, Russia, support Iran's continuation, resupply, and attrition objectives in this war. Try to shorten the war so they can agree, yes, and announce, we want to shorten the war. Are you saying to me that neither Trump nor Putin have leverage with each other and with Europe? I think that's not correct in the evidence. It's not correct in the evidence. Yes, I agree with you. Japan and South Korea and China all suffer significantly from and India, the loss of Hormuz. Therefore, we know that Russia can supply some, but not anywhere near the needs of those three states. But if Trump, for example, said, sell your oil to Japan, South Korea, and Europe, but not China, we don't know. But we know that the Chinese and Russian sides are at loggerheads with a different strategic difference they keep mentioning but don't specify on how to handle the United States. We know that India, for example, has taken Israel's side and the US side in the war. In the war, they've taken the other side. So I'm not sure what part of the evidence you disagree with.
I don't agree with John with the concept that Russia would somehow stop helping Iran or China in the fight that they have against the United States, because so far, John, with the case of Ukraine, Russia has learned a lot. The United States, doesn't matter under the Biden administration, under the Trump administration, they're saying that we're not helping Ukraine, we're not doing this and that. Russia knows that the United States is running the show, providing intelligence, providing pilots, providing everything to Ukraine to fight this war. Then they can say, we're not helping Iran. We're not going to provide Iran with the intelligence, with the information, but they're going to do it. They don't need to be brag on, because this is the game that the United States has started in Ukraine. For 4 years, they're doing this. Why does Russia need to declare that they're helping Iran? Why does China need to do that? They can do it without declaring, without talking about it.
You've lost me a bit. Nobody's suggesting that Russia and China will announce the degree of help. What we do know is they made no effort to deter. Second, we don't know what resupply has happened since the war began, but none is apparent. Third, we have lots of suggestions of Chinese, for example, the claim that there's a Chinese intelligence ship sitting in the Sea of Oman has come from a lot of social media reports, but all the maritime trackers put that vessel off the coast, at mooring off the coast of Shanghai. So I have to say, I see no convincing evidence. I see one podcaster after another repeating that there's this help, okay? Repeating doesn't make true. Evidence is what it is. We know that there's an improvement in Iranian targeting. We know that there's a survival. We know a lot about the operational stuff, and you'll have more today when Ted Postel comes on. But no, I'm not saying that Russia's going to make a declaration. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that China's going to make a declaration. In fact, what they've said is lots of support in words and no clarity on what they'll do in action. And what I've said is that politically, in each of these countries, there's a faction in favor of more support, and there's a faction for less support. There's a faction for saying, US is our priority. We want to end this particular battlefield conflict and find some modus vivendi with the United States first. There's a faction in Moscow. There's a faction of that in China. And when I watch Mr. what's his name, Zhang Zhuiqin, I see him representing a faction in China. He never talks about what is exactly happening in China. He waxes extremely inaccurately on every other country, but never about China. And what he represents is a factional view in China, which he doesn't reveal. Okay, everybody is, let's say, trying to speak from a political point of view in each of these places: India, China, Russia, for a start, and the United States. But now that we see Putin talking to Trump about how to settle the war in Iran, Trump will go to Beijing in a few days' time, March 31st. If the war continues, China is really suffering. So is South Korea, so is Japan, to repeat your points. There's no doubt about that. We're not denying that. The arithmetic of oil supply, oil consumption, oil imports, and so forth tell us exactly how much China will lose, at least 1% of GDP, if the Hormuz Strait stays closed. Ditto Japan, ditto South Korea. From a US point of view, the more trouble it can generate inside China is a war aim, a strategic aim. So it seems to me perfectly predictable that Trump would try to use Russia now, offer a quick end to the war in the Ukraine in exchange for sanctions relief, which is on the table as one of the Russian end of war terms, and some not so public commitments with respect to Iran later if the war continues, and with respect to China if the war continues. I don't see how we're disagreeing here. I think there's enough evidence to show that this is how the Russian side is debating what to do. And has anyone got the confidence to say that we know how long Iran can sustain its war, how long the Americans can sustain their war? The Americans could lose their Middle East bases at the end of this and come away still with strategically believing that they have strategically moved on to China, which is the bigger enemy. They can say they've won over India from Russia. They've driven wedges between the three BRICS founders, China, Russia, and India. If the US thinks that, and if the US thinks it's destroyed Iran's capability for the future, it can, as it were, sacrifice its Middle Eastern bases. Arabs lose, Israel loses. I'm not saying this is the outcome we know of the war, but because we don't know how it will end, do we? We don't even know whether it'll be short or long, do we? If it's not short, what I'm saying is there is now evidence on the table from this phone call that Putin is ready to cut a deal with President Trump on the Dmitriev, Vitkov, Kushner side. That's what the evidence suggests to me. Now, I'm happy to be corrected and said, and you tell me that there is other evidence of what Russia's doing. I don't see it. I see this is the evidence. I see in India and Delhi, one of the only embassies of the big powers to criticize India and endorse solidarity with Iran was the Russian ambassador Ampilov. He went to the Iranian embassy in Delhi and announced full solidarity with Iran, Iran's government, and Iran's people. That was a particular message for the Modi government of criticism that the Modi government took Israel's side, the US side. That's a Russian action too, a foreign ministry action, not a Kremlin action. I mean, one's looking at little pieces of evidence and trying to put them together without wishful thinking, without the belief that there is a strategic alliance that binds Russia, China, India, and Iran together, because this war has broken them apart. This war has broken first India, which has taken Netanyahu's side. At least the Modi prime ministry has fully endorsed Netanyahu and the US. And we could get into what was done that led to the sinking of the Iranian frigate, the Dena, by the US submarine. But India has clearly taken the other side. China and Russia, like you say, have said unmistakable words of support. But they have also now indicated, Wang on Sunday put in the last few hours, a readiness to come to terms with Trump for each one's own advantage on their battlefields. That's called cutting a deal if you were in one faction. It's called stabbing in the back if you're in another faction. I don't think I'm misreading the evidence, and I don't think I'm inventing things like I've seen some podcasters who try to invent an alliance that isn't there, and the destruction of an empire which isn't there either. Their hopes, yes. Their values, yes. Their moral objectives, yes. But I don't see the political evidence that they're happening right now. But I on the one hand, I hear you saying you're frustrated with my reading of the evidence. On the other hand, I think we agree with each other. So I'm not sure where we are.
No, I'm not frustrated, John. The way I understand the whole case, because you remember when the war in Ukraine started, there were all of these theories that Iran is betraying Russia, China is betraying, China is not supporting that much Russia in her war in Ukraine. But looking at what has happened in the last 4 years, it was amazing. After 2 years, we've learned how much Iran and China were helping Russia in the war in Ukraine. I think what is happening with the case of Iran is the same. Russia and China is helping Iran. They're helping a lot. They don't need to send weapons to Iran. Iran doesn't need weapons for the time being because they have everything to fight back. Yes. And I think what is happening, the outcome of both the war in Ukraine, the war in the West Asia, would be a better, more connected relationship between Russia, China on one side, and Iran. I would say these three countries would come out of these wars in a better shape because they totally understand that this triangle is so much important for the future. It's not just about Russia. We know that Russia and China are superpowers. Iran is in a location. The location of Iran as a country is so much important. And you mentioned, we see what was happening in the West Asia. There is no country. There is no real player. That's why they're calling Putin to do something with the case of the war against the Arab states, with what is happening in Saudi Arabia, UAE. People understand the situation. In my opinion, what would be the outcome? It would be the United States, and Donald Trump is not forever the president of the United States. In next 2 to 3 years, Donald Trump would be out of office, and the policies in Washington would be different. I'm not saying that drastically they would change their policies, but they're going to have different techniques in order to implement the policies, the hegemony of the United States. But what the Putin administration is trying to do, in my opinion, they're trying to reduce the collateral damage in Ukraine. The whole goal in Ukraine and negotiations with Kirill Dmitriev is that, because there is no way Ukraine being, capable of continuing the war. They're
Well, they
gonna.
don't. Well, excuse me. They don't think that. The Europeans think they can continue.
It
And the
doesn't
UK.
matter, John. It doesn't matter. You look at what is happening with the economy in Europe. Why are they right now in a desperate situation? Their economy is not doing well right now with the case of the war against Iran. How do you expect that Russia would help them in such a situation they're in?
I think we're talking at cross purposes. Why don't we just say, I don't see that if it's the view, if your view is Iran wins the war of attrition and the war, let's say, goes on 4 to 6 or 8, 2 months or 3 months, yes? The Strait of Hormuz closes. In that outcome,
who's the loser in that outcome, John? Who's the loser?
Fine. Well, China has exhausted its 90-day reserve capacity and loses approximately 1% of its GDP and suffers internal significant inflation of a kind it hasn't experienced for a long time. India loses. The Arab monarchies lose very significantly. A demonstration that Iran can punch through any US protection, that US protection for the Arab monarchies has failed. The Arab monarchies, Saudi, Kuwaiti, Bahraini, Qatari, and Emirati, they've all failed very significantly politically in face of their own voters. You understand that? And their economies have also suffered because they can't export. They've suffered also. Yes, all of that. Israel has suffered from the clear demonstration that neither their air defenses nor the American air defenses can protect them from all manner of highly accurate counterattack. All of that. Iran has suffered significantly too, but it wins by surviving. The others don't win by surviving. They face severe internal and long-term and medium-term economic problems. There's no doubt Russia gains in the short to medium term, but if the entire world goes into recession and demand for oil falls, Russia suffers from that. But in the short to medium term, Russia gains. Yes. The United States, well, let's say that at the midterms, if there was high inflation, rising casualties, and no certainty for the short war to end, like Trump continues to advertise, then Trump's a loser. Yes. But I think I've just described everybody, with the exception of Russia, in the short term, losing, and others lose, and some losing more than others. Yes. And Iran survives everything the United States and Israel threw at it and destroys the Arab monarchies' domestic security. That's a very big strategic gain. So if we add it all up, Iran gains, Russia gains, and everybody else loses. Would that
how
be
about John? How about Iran doing the same as we saw with the Houthis in the Red Sea in the Bab el-Mandab? They said all the tankers can,
Yes.
pass through the. They can select who's gonna use this Strait of Hormuz. They say China can use it, Russia can use it,
Well,
but this is
in the short term. What are we looking at? We're looking at the claim that the U.S. Navy can try to force it open. In the last few hours, President Macron has said, I'm sending a fleet of 8 vessels, including an aircraft carrier and frigates and what have you, to open the Hormuz. So what we're seeing is the alliance against Iran saying we can force Hormuz open in the short term. So we'll have a fight over
We've
whether
seen that in the Red Sea, by the way. We've seen that.
Yes, exactly so. We don't disagree. We've seen it fail. The European combination to try to keep the Red Sea open failed completely. Yes, Yemen suffered immense destruction. Houthis survived and proved that they can control the Bab el Mandab. Yes. So we would expect and hope that Iran's announced capacity to do that in the Hormuz will prevail. We'll be back next week to find out.
Yeah.
However, we've just run through a list of, let's say, strategic losses and strategic gains. What I'm saying is being different, though. What I'm saying is not so hopeful, but rather realistic, that China will, in March the 31st, welcome President Trump, not as a war criminal, not as the attacker of China's ally in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That is a strategic military and security association between Iran and China and Russia. China will welcome the attacker of one of their allies for their own benefit. I'm saying the last few hours, President Putin had a telephone call with Trump to reach something similar, that the Chinese don't trust the Russians, nor the Russians trust the Chinese, to cut their own separate deal to each other's disadvantage, and even more so between Russia, China, and India. So that's, in my view, a rather more, how to say, uncertain and strategically a weaker outcome than we expected, isn't it?
Yeah. My opinion is that, my humble opinion, that there is no way for anybody at this particular moment, with the current situation, with the quality of the relationship between Russia and China, nobody's capable of dividing them, in my opinion. It's all gone. This could be somehow, if the Trump administration feel that they can separate China from Russia, or they can separately negotiate with them in order to put the other side in a bad position, in a bad, I don't see that happening, John. I don't see. The United States is not that much capable of doing that. They have shown us in the last 12 months, more than 12 months of the Trump administration, they show how incapable they are. They don't have a strategy. They started this war against Iran, John, on a single, assumption that they can do the regime change. It all failed. It's all about the failures after failures. I don't see that much of a strategy in the United States. I don't see Russia and China being trapped by the Trump administration, because they're not smart enough to do that.
Well,
and Russia and China are not that naive to be trapped in this scenario that Trump is trying to make for them.
No one's naive. We agree on that point. Second, there are factions in China, and there are factions in Moscow, and there are factions in Delhi that think differently, that think you can cut a separate deal with the United States for the advantage of themselves, their constituents, their part of the economy, for the medium term. And in politics is a short to medium term game. It's not a long term game. The military factions in Beijing and the military faction in Moscow think differently from the political faction. And arguably, there have been much closer relations between the militaries of China, Iran, and Russia than there have been at the political level, and certainly at the business level. So what we're saying is, we can't sum it all up into one message.
Yeah.
What we're saying is that this war has triggered political argument, bitter argument, ferocious argument. People saying, we told you so. This would happen. We warned you. You weren't listening. factional fighting in Beijing has demonstrably produced a purge of the senior military. We understand, but not from any Chinese podcaster, that there's been significant differences in fighting between President Xi and the military commands. We understand in Russia there's a significant factional fight between the Dmitriev pro-American group that includes the central bank governor and has had Putin's support, and including support in yesterday's telephone call, versus the intelligence services, the foreign ministry, and the general staff in the way to fight the Ukraine war, in the way to defeat the United States in the broader European war. We understand all these things, and it's not so different in Delhi either. So what I'm saying is I can't predict how the course of the war as it continues will affect the faction fighting in each of these capitals. What we can see right now is attempts by the Russian side to cut a deal with Trump, and attempts by the Chinese side to cut a deal, and attempts by the Indian side to cut a deal. And in each of those cases, worst of all, or most negative of all, in the Indian case, Iran is relegated. Iran is treated. The Indian side took against Iran, no doubt about it. China and Russia haven't taken that step. No.
No. Thank you. Thank you, John.
Okay.
I think there is a lot to be learned from ongoing conflicts and wars. And great pleasure, John, as always.
Me too. Thank you for having me, Nima. See you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.